You're listening to Foodagogy, where we explore what food can teach us about becoming totally inclusive schools. I'm Angeline Au, and I believe that dynamic conversations about inclusion, diversity, and equity happen around the table. Every episode, I sit down with someone whose relationship with food reveals something essential about identity, community, and belonging, the same things we're trying to cultivate in our classrooms. Whether you are wrestling with inclusion in your institution, a foodie, curious about culinary cultures, or simply someone who believes that every child deserves to thrive at school, you belong here. Thank you for tuning into these food-related conversations that nourish both heart and pedagogical practice. Let's see what's cooking with our food industry professional guest. So I'm honored to welcome Jake Potashnick, chef, writer, and founder of Feld restaurant in Chicago's Ukrainian Village. Jake's culinary journey spans 14 acclaimed kitchens across 8 different countries, from Michelin-starred restaurants in Japan and France to a beloved Ernst restaurant in Berlin, where we first met. And at Feld, Jake introduces a relationship-to-table philosophy, emphasizing deep connections with local farmers and producers to create a dining experience rooted in community and care. And through his storytelling on TikTok and writing, Jake also narrates how hospitality transforms food into meaningful shared experiences. So I'm excited to unpack a lot of that with us here today. So welcome, Jake.
Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us about you. Share with us your earliest food memories.
Yeah, I mean, I'm from Chicago originally, and I think my earliest food memories they're very cliche. Both my grandmas were very good cooks. And my mom was a great cook and would make dinner every night. And my parents are very adventurous eaters. So from a young age, like we would, what I like to say is the first word I could spell was cow. The second word I could spell was satay, because we would go eat so much Thai food. So I definitely was sort of immersed in food from a very young age. I'll realize pretty early on that I wanted to be a professional chef. It kind of was the clear path from like the time I was 7.
And so you mentioned, I guess, I'm imagining you spending hours in the kitchen with your mother, grandmothers. Did that happen, or was it like sort of like, as you know, you're becoming a chef? Because, I have a son, he's 11. He says, I want to be a chef, because I like to take him to different restaurants, but he spends no time in the kitchen. Yeah. So some of your early food memories, were they part of being there, making things together?
100%. I mean, there was a lot of like me peering over the shoulder, helping cook. Whenever we'd visit my grandma's, it was making cookies or joining in. And then I grew up in like the prime era of early Food Network. So when my parents needed to distract me, they sat me down in front of the TV and I would watch Alton Brown or Early Emerald, like those kind of shows before, when it was still chefs cooking and not sort of TV personalities. And, I like to joke my origin story is I was in 8th grade. I had to do a science fair project. You did science fair at my school 5th through 8th grade. Every year you had to do a science fair project. 5th through 7th grade, they assigned you something. And then 8th grade, they said, do whatever you want. And you could, as long as it's somewhat related to science. And being in Chicago, the most famous restaurant here is Alinea, which has 3 Michelin stars at Grant Achatz. The restaurant's been around for 20 years now. And when they opened, they were a restaurant driven by molecular gastronomy, by science food, if you will, very influenced by El Bulli out in Spain. And they were called by Bon Appetit magazine, by Ruth Reichel, a very big food critic here in the States, the best restaurant in America a year after they opened. And I was in 8th grade and had to do my science fair project, and I emailed them. And I said, hi, my name's Jake, and I heard you do science and food. Could you show me around? And to my surprise, to this day, Grant Achatz, the owner chef, emailed back and was like, sure. Come in. And he gave me a personal tour of Alinea. It was May 7th, 2007. I walked away in complete awe. And it wasn't the science, like that was cool. Like they showed us how to use tapioca maltodextrin to make powdered oils and gelins and all these things and spherifications. Like that was cool. But what blew my mind was the rows of the chefs and cooks in their chef's whites. And it was silent and it was this stunning, beautiful, polished kitchen. And I was like, Why would anybody not do this for a living? And so, yeah, it's kind of been downhill since then.
Why do you use the term downhill?
Again, like more like a rolling snowball, less bad.
So it sounds like a lot of your personal identity and what shaped you, has is also coming out in how you've also like shaped and brought that kind of DNA into your own restaurant. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your personal values and cultural experiences that you've mentioned, like growing up in Chicago and also having traveled around working in different places, how has all of that kind of culminated into Feld?
Personally, I'm a bit of a cultural mishmash. I mean, my mom comes from German immigrants who escaped Germany in the 30s as Jews and moved to Waco, Texas, and became dairy farmers in Waco. My dad is from Russian immigrants who ended up in New York, in Brooklyn, in the Italian neighborhood. Even though there's no Italian there, my grandma cooked the best spaghetti and meatballs. And then they met in Chicago, so sort of meeting in the middle, if you will. And I have been very, very lucky in the opportunities to travel and work. I mean, I graduated college and essentially immediately moved to Sweden. And I went from Sweden to Japan to France to Germany. And then there were stints in Thailand and other places. When I was working on opening Feld, I did not want it to be a restaurant that felt like a Japanese restaurant, that felt like a German restaurant. Yeah, I wanted it to be the summation of my experience through the lens of my own personal being. And whatever that means. And so, we met at Ernst. I was at Ernst for 2 years, and Ernst has been incredibly influential on me personally in my career. The philosophy of Ernst is the DNA of Feld, but I am not Dylan Watson Braun. I am not the owner of Ernst. I am not, and that was a very Japanese restaurant. And I did not want to have a restaurant that felt that Japanese, because I also am not Japanese, and I've spent time there and interned there, but I didn't want to open a Japanese restaurant without saying I'm going to dedicate my life to mastering Japanese cuisine, which Dylan has. So, the DNA of Feld is all of these experiences. It's things I took from my time in Sweden and France and Japan and Germany, but put through this Midwestern lens of what is comforting in Chicago, because the Midwest to me is this place of hospitality. Like my girlfriend was raised in LA and had never been to Chicago. And she came when we were going to move to Chicago. She came to visit. And within the first day, like 4 different people started talking to us like on the street, just like, hey, how's it going? And she goes, did you plant these people, or are people just nice here? And it's like, that's Midwestern hospitality. So how do you take all of the culinary experience, all that philosophy of work with farms and producers? Like everywhere I've ever worked has been a small fine dining tasting menu spot driven by working directly with farmers and producers. And how do we apply that so that it works in the Midwest and works in Chicago? And that's like the core DNA of Feld.
Amazing. I love how you said that we are a summation of our experiences, our background, what we're exposed to, the knowledge that we gain over the years, and the influences that become also part of us. And so Feld sounds like it's a way in which you can creatively express parts of you. And it also sounds like, parts of you being who you are and your experiences. I mean, like you mentioned that going into Alenia in 2007. And so some of the people listening to this might be like, gosh, in 2007, I'd already been teaching for 10 years. And so there are some gaps, whether it's intergenerational or having something really different, right? And so I feel like from what I've read about your restaurant, and I would travel to the States to go to Chicago to visit if I could, but Feld, has been described as kind of going against the grain of the Chicago's food scene. What risks did you take in creating something that didn't follow the city's culinary expectations? And how did you kind of navigate being seen as a disruptor?
I'm going to really quickly jump to one of the things you just said about this idea of sort of like putting things through your own lens. And there's a quote I love, and I'm going to paraphrase it. I do not ever get it right, but it's Conan O'Brien gave a commencement speech at Dartmouth, and he talks about your failure to become your perceived ideals allows for profound reinvention and for you to be unique. And I think I wanted more than anything else to be Grant Achatz, and the ways in which I am not Grant Achatz has made me Jake Potashnick. With Feld in Chicago, I came back and I took a risk. Chicago is historically a city of steak and potatoes. That's what the Midwest is in many ways. And I came back and said, I want to do something really, really niche and specific. And I deemed it relationship to table. And the reason I called it that is because having been in this industry long enough, I'd kind of burned out on this concept of farm to table because it felt like a buzzword more than anything else. All produce comes from farms. I joke at McDonald's has had a farm to table salad. It doesn't mean anything anymore. So I wanted to come up with some term that just helped imply we're trying to do things deeper. We're trying to really get to know our producers, and we don't work with people unless we go out and visit them. I mean, I flew to Maine in September to meet a fisherman. I flew to Atlanta to meet a bacon and ham producer, that's where their smokehouse is. For me, it's really important to get to know these people. I flew to California to meet the owner of this trout farm that does the best trout, because I want to see with my own eyes what's happening. And then, of course, all of our produce comes from around Chicago, around the Midwest, from Michigan, Indiana, Illinois. And I drive to farms constantly to meet those people. And that's very unique for this city. There are some restaurants doing things like that, not a lot doing it at the level we're trying, which is fine dining tasting menu. So, the inherent risk was, what if people just don't, what if they don't get it and what if they don't like it? Which are very different risks, because they could get it and not like it, and they could like it and not get it. Our first sort of giant glowing review was from the biggest food critic in Chicago, which is Louisa Chu, who's the food critic at the Chicago Tribune, our biggest newspaper. And she came in December and we got 3.5 out of 4 stars. And it's just like this glowing review. And her and I were having a call after she dined when she was doing her background research for the article. And she used to be a chef. She worked at El Bulli. She worked at the most famous restaurant in the world at one point. And on the phone, she goes, when we were at El Bulli, we used to talk about if El Bulli would work not anywhere else in the world, or if it had to be in that part of Spain for it to be a success. And she goes, I was thinking about that when I ate at Feld, because Feld is such a bold choice for Chicago, and I hope that it works. And so it has been a challenge. It's 100% been a challenge introducing it to the city and trying to get our message, our mindset across. And, how to navigate being seen as a disruptor. It's I'm constantly navigating it. It's not oh, we did it. It's not, we're about a year in. We're at 11 months today. And so it's we're still constantly fighting for attention and for understanding. And I don't know if that's ever going to stop.
And I guess you're also having to do that, not just from, you focusing on the service that you're trying to deliver with the food and, the dining experiences that you're trying to cultivate with your team for people who come to your restaurant. But as, the owner, you also have to consider, how do you use social media around that? How do you tell your story around that as well, right? And so yeah.
And also, one of the key things for me, and anybody who comes eat at Feld will experience this, is our food is, for Chicago, pretty minimalist. I mean, it's so produce driven and pretty minimalist in that aspect. And one of the things I knew from the beginning was we had to give guests a touchstone, so something incredibly relatable, so that we could sort of earn some trust to do food that's a little bit more bizarre. And for me, that's hospitality. When you walk into Feld, we all line the doorway. We welcome you in this giant greeting. The room is incredibly comfortable and warm. It feels like somebody's living room. Everybody sits around the sides of the room and looks into the middle, almost like an omakase bar, but you're seated. You're at a banquet. The cooking's in the middle. It's not like an actual bar. We have tables. And I felt like if we could give guests an experience that felt warm and comforting, we could get away with more in the kitchen. And I think that has allowed us to sneak in some ways, some weirder stuff to this city. Sometimes I think we give people a stranger experience than they realize because the hospitality is so warm and comforting.
So what I'm hearing is not just relationships with producers, but also forming relationships with your guests in the restaurant. Oh, yeah. And through that trust, you're asking people to trust you enough to take them on a different experience that they may not have had before, so that they can expand their thoughts around what is quite different in a food scene that they may be very familiar with and have different expectations.
One of the beautiful things has been getting to know so many of our guests and earning that trust.
I can imagine too that after you've earned that trust, you have people who then come back to something that then starts to become familiar, right? So when you try something new and different for the first time, it is going to be different. And depending on how open you are to new ideas, you're going to react differently to that. Like if someone flex enough to accept a different, whether it be an idea or a different taste or a different way of dining, like you're saying, like I went to visit some friends in the States and I was always surprised at how large the portions were. Like they're enormous. So I could imagine like, the style of food that you're serving there is very different to that.
But again, talking about like touchstones to keep it somewhat relatable, it's like, I don't really want to serve a piece of beef as my main course. I mean, you're having like 25 courses. I don't really want to give you a piece of beef, but I also understand that there is a certain level of expected perceived value from our guests that they want that main course meat protein. So we do that, but we find ways to do it that feel right and unique to us. We have a couple dry agers and we age our beef for a really long period of time and we cook it just over cherry wood embers. And we try to keep it unique, but it's this very fine balancing of an act of like, if I'm going to give you a raw asparagus as the opening bite and say, just eat a raw piece of asparagus, then I'm also going to give you a very comforting piece of beef as your main course. And we like to joke like the Feld experience, give or take, it's 2.5, 3 hours. There are restaurants that you can go to that you're there for your time with your friends and the restaurant is just sort of around you. That's most restaurants. You're going to have a good time with a friend or your partner or whoever to eat. When you come into Feld, you're in our world. You're not here to sit at your table and do anything. You're here because we're going to put you into our world. There's some people who come very willingly into our world and into the experience we provide. And then there's some people who we have to sort of figure out how to bring them into our world. And there's very rarely kicking and screaming. But, the opening bite on the menu right now is a raw piece of asparagus with a little dip. And that's because I drive to Michigan every week to pick up the freshest asparagus from this one farm that grows amazing asparagus. But that's a bizarre opener when you think about it. And so from the start, we're telling you our intention of like, this is the goal here. This is what we're about. But then we follow that up with a very comforting bite. It's like this yeasted pancake with bacon jam. We're saying, we're going to give you something very bizarre, but then we're going to give you something that makes you come back to us. And that's in many ways the roller coaster of the experience. And the farther into the meal we get, the more bizarre we can be longer because we've won a little trust, we've earned a little bit, and then we're going to get weirder a bit, and then we get comforting very briefly again. And so how do you kind of keep bringing guests back in and then keep them? And we find that like almost all of our guests leave and they're like, that was like no experience I've ever had, and I loved it. I mean, it's pretty rare now that we get guests who are unhappy.
Amazing. Sounds like you've put so much thought into shaping that whole experience. Like it's sort of like building a symphony where, like if someone's sitting through something for like 2 to 3 hours, like how do I, not just have the same, music coming at you for the whole time and all of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm going to make this part here like this and kind of like change it up. And so that like, okay, I'm waking up now to that same taste and experience. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, here's the comfortable chorus coming back at you. And then all of a sudden it's like, so it sounds like an amazing symphony of different things that you're doing. But as you said, like not everything is everyone's taste, right? And so I think after opening Feld, you received some intense scrutiny and even backlash. And so how did you stay grounded in your values and lead like your team through that period of uncertainty?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important context is like that we received a lot of internet backlash, and I kind of knew that was going to happen. Like I had done some social media videos about how restaurants are not given time to grow and develop now because everybody wants to be the first in the door, the first to give a review, the first social media video about it. The backlash we got was all like business related. Like I want to, because we use the word cancel culture, I want to be careful there because it wasn't like people were like, oh my God, they're abusive. Like that's a very different thing. Like I was never worried about us being canceled. That was not a thing. I mean, the feedback we were getting at the start was about seasoning and about plating. And it's like, maybe I came back Ernst, Ernst, like we did not salt a lot at Ernst. We had a very specific mindset of what the palate should be. And I probably brought that back a little too quickly to Chicago and maybe had to adjust the seasoning here and there. And that was all sort of the first month was the internet came for us. And you get this critique, you get this feedback, and you have choices. And as the boss, as the owner, as the chef, it's my job to sponge all of that up, all the feedback, good and bad, and then decide what of it is useful, what of it is internet hostility, and what of it is this is a truly good opinion that can help us. And then you adjust around that. And as a team, the most important thing is to just put your head down and work. I don't know anybody who's had the story Feld has had in its first 10 months. I mean, we were marked for dead from the internet after a month. Like, truly. They were like, this restaurant's never going to last. It's terrible. A month and a half later, we got so good that we got our first really nice review from Chicago Magazine. Then we got Chicago Tribune 2 months after that. Then we got added to the Michelin Guide, recognized. And then I got nominated for a James Beard for Best Emerging Chef. Like, the first 7 months of this restaurant are the greatest roller coaster in restaurant history. We were marked for dead, and now people are like, oh, they're really doing something great. Two of the biggest critics in that first month, who gave us the intense scrutiny and backlash, came back to eat in the last month and have written resoundingly glowing reviews. It's been very interesting. And it was hard. I mean, emotionally, mentally, physically, I spent years building this dream and then just got punched in the gut. But luckily, I have an amazing team around me, and a team that was committed to the idea of let's put our heads down and work harder and listen to some feedback and not listen to some other feedback. And we're going to regain the trust of the city. And I think we're still fighting some of that backlash, not because guests who come feel the same criticism, but because the first word out there was negative. And so that is still what's in a lot of people's minds when they hear about Feld. But the number one thing we have going for us is word of mouth, which is guests come, they love it, they tell their friends to come eat. And like every night, we have such a small restaurant, I can talk to every table. And I go, how'd you hear about us? Like 50% of the people are like, oh, a friend came and ate and was like, this is the best meal I've ever had. And so we are relying on like sort of this natural organic growth over time. The backlash was kind of good for us. The restaurant went quiet for a month and a half, 2 months. And it allowed us to sort of really focus on what we were doing with a smaller, more intimate room before we got busier again. And then when all the good stuff came out and we were super busy again, we were ready for it. And it was different. And the team is better and different as a result of that. So, at the time it was miserable and I thought I was going to lose my restaurant in 2 months. And now with retrospect on my side, it maybe is the best thing that happened to us.
Amazing. I love what you said. Just put your head down and work, but not just work the same, but work by thinking about what is the feedback? What is the reaction? How do we rebuild trust in terms of like, what do I take back and how can I push my own, ways of doing things a little bit? What am I flex on, but still remaining true to my core is what I'm hearing as well.
Yeah, one of the key things was we never changed our philosophy. We never changed that hospitality. From the start, people loved the hospitality. But you look at the food and you go, what is not connecting with people here? And why? I don't think every dish needs to connect with people. We don't do nostalgia-driven food because everybody has different memories and different childhoods. So I don't want to cook around the idea of nostalgia. So I don't need to connect with people that way. And I don't need to think every dish needs to connect with people. There can be some bizarre things. But if people are saying that they're leaving and not connecting with anything culinarily, then you have an issue you have to discuss. And, to be honest, I know Ernst went through very similar problems when they opened. One of their first big reviews said something along the lines of like, we got served a carrot on a plate. But I know that carrot was a very specific carrot from a very specific farmer, treated a very specific way, and it was amazing. But that's not for everybody. And I know that that's a thing that anybody who's doing extremist food, brutalist food, minimalist food, opinionated food has to wrestle with.
It sounds to me like for opinions to change, we need time. And sometimes in some cutthroat industries like the restaurant business, you don't have that working on your side when you're trying to launch a new place. But when you have found that by kind of just sticking with your core principles that you really wanted to have, you were able to build that trust over time, and you had a great team also working with you. And your team seems to like also include, and you've been very intentional, I think, about, giving voice to producers and rethinking how you source. And so it feels to me like you're also by principle trying to be really socially responsible in how you are representing producers and bringing that relationship to the table. And so what does like social responsibility look like to you in the restaurant industry?
Yeah, Feld was in many ways sort of this attempt to show that you can run a restaurant in a way that I think is the right way to run a restaurant. And what I mean by that is, taking that Ernst mentality of sourcing of like, I go to the market, we pick up produce, we get deliveries from farms, and we create a menu based on what we get. The Feld menu is constantly ever changing. We do not have set dishes on our menu. That's the hardest way to run a restaurant. I don't get to say, here's the menu for the next 3 months, train the team in it, and go, let's do something else now. I also felt it was very important to take care of the team. In the US, healthcare is not a given. So we cover health insurance for everybody. I offer dental and vision care. We have a 4-day work week. We're only open for 4 days. We do 1 seating 3 of those days and 2 seatings on Saturday. So it's not an incredibly intense service day. We do a 20% service charge instead of tips. I mean, obviously tips in the US, big thing. We do a 20% service charge, which acts it, and then we say we don't want tips. And that acts as a revenue sharing system. All that service charge goes directly to the team as part of their paycheck. And so when the restaurant's doing well, the team makes a lot of money. And when the restaurant's not doing well, we all bite the bones a little bit. And so it was just important to me that everybody felt taken care of, that they got paid well. And I've been very lucky. I've had the same team essentially since opening. Like I've not lost a cook since opening, which is like unheard of in this industry for a year. And I think it's because they're really happy here. I don't know are you familiar with Alice Waters out at Chez Panisse in Berkeley?
Tell me more.
So Alice is like the original farm to table chef in America. She's out in Berkeley and worked with farms, and it's a little more casual than Feld, but it's been around since, God, I don't know, the 80s, the 70s, probably earlier than that, maybe the 60s. But Alice has always been a giant proponent of small organic farming, and she's a really big believer that every single human should have a farm in their backyard or their front yard, and that we should be growing our own food, and that we should not be trusting giant corporate farm systems. I don't agree with Alice. I know farmers really, really well, and I think the idea of everybody having to work a job and have a family and farm is silly. And especially somewhere in Chicago where we have an incredibly deep winter. So you'd have to spend all summer growing to preserve for the winter. Like, I'm not naive enough to be like, we need every single individual out there to change how they eat and how they work and how they employ. But I do believe that by doing a small business done the right way, if we can influence our block, and if that can influence our neighborhood, and if that can influence the next couple miles, if I can create this little sphere of people who see what we're doing and are interested in that, I think that is very influential. That to me is grassroots growth of, hey, look, that restaurant is able to give all their cooks health insurance as a new restaurant. Like, it's one thing if you've been around for 10 years, but as a new restaurant, core tenant, they were able to do that and survive and locally source and do this thing. Then maybe it just inspires another restaurant owner to go, you know what, let's try this. And another one, let's try this. And oh, wait, their staff retention's incredible. Maybe they're doing something right there. Because losing staff is, like, from a business standpoint, obviously frustrating, but incredibly expensive. Like, the time to retrain somebody is like $50,000 in lost opportunity cost. It's ridiculous numbers. So when you get great staff retention because you're taking care of people, it's a great business move. So, Feld is a restaurant driven what I believe is the socially responsible way to run a restaurant. I don't expect everybody to do that, but hopefully I can show some people it's doable.
I love what I'm hearing. And it feels like with your restaurant, your criteria for success are those things you've mentioned. Like, I feel like I'm successful if my staff are happy and I can retain them. And whereas some traditional models of being successful in a capitalist world is all about this linear idea of trajectory of like, oh, maybe I got, X amount of reviews, or I have X amount of diners, or I make X amount of money. Whereas what I'm hearing is kind of like more of a donut economic style kind of like, yeah, this is what I feel makes me successful.
They should go side by side, right? Like, look, I have investors who put a lot of money into Feld and took a chance on me. I do not take that lightly. But they all knew how important it was to me to take care of. Like, none of them are going to be like, hey, stop paying the staff health insurance so we can get paid back faster. Like, I did not bring on those type of investors. That being said, it is important to me to work to pay them back. And as a 1-year-old restaurant, we're not there yet. We're getting there. But I think the most impressive thing when you're talking social responsibility is balancing those two things of like, I want to do the right thing, but I want to prove you can do the right thing while also taking care of people in the old school way of like, I want to pay back my investors while also taking care of my team. And I do think as a business, if you can't do both, then you have to rethink some things and maybe you shouldn't be running the business. So, I'm looking at this long term and going, how are we getting to the point where we're making enough money to pay back the investors because we've been prioritizing the team? I wish the world worked differently, but it doesn't. So I think we need to prove that traditional business can work in the context of a socially responsible business.
What a wonderful way to try and have a social impact by just doing it and acting as a model. And so, yeah, it sounds like as a ripple effect from what you've been describing, I feel like it has also happened here in Berlin, where you also lived for a while, like restaurants, like you were describing. I think you worked at Barra, like they don't open on the weekend. And so, yeah, it's kind of unheard of for a restaurant. Like, you would kind of assume that it's the weekend where things might happen. Or Malaysian Singaporean restaurant called Mamakan here, who like just kind of said, these are our opening hours, and this is the team that we want to have. And this is what we're going to do. And they've been successful for 5 years now and sticking through to their values and really going against the grain of, we don't want to have those stereotypical kind of TV series about toxic restaurant culture. And so I love how restaurants like yours and owners and chef like you are kind of saying, no, there's a different way to do this. And we want to be on the more socially responsible side of the industry. And this also can be successful. So as we close our episode today, I'd love to ask you some typical closing questions I've asked all my guests. And the first one is, what is your go-to comfort food, Jake?
Thai food. My go-to comfort food is Thai food. It's always been my favorite cuisine. Specifically, I'll give a shout out to one restaurant here in Chicago, Siam Noodle and Rice. They're in Uptown. They do a dish called fried dried beef. It is essentially deep fried Thai beef jerky, and it's served with homemade hot sauce and sticky rice. And it is my perfect dish. I love it so much.
Amazing. I love that. Shouting out and supporting fellow Chicago restaurants. That's great. And finally, if you were to cook supper for someone you treasure, what would you have on the menu and why?
Oh, it feels so person specific. An omelet, like a perfect French omelet that really takes time to do right, is a sign of skills. So just I'm passionate about it, but also like a perfect omelet to me is like a labor of love. I really sit there over my omelet for 15 minutes and make it really custardy and cook it as slow as I can. So it almost becomes like a natural sabayon, whipped egg inside the omelet. And so I don't know if I'd cook supper for somebody I treasure with that, but I'd cook them brunch. I'd make a really good French omelet.
Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your journey, your story about yourself and your own identity, but also the identity of your restaurant. And I hope one day I'll be able to come and dine at Feld.
We'd love to have you and Benny in. It's been too long.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you to Jake Potashnick for sharing your food memories, industry insights, and for modeling how a commitment to a mission and vision can lead to rewarding impacts. In 2025, Jake was an emerging chef semi-finalist at the James Beard Awards. Since this episode was recorded in December 2025, Jake's restaurant Feld was awarded a Michelin Star in the second year after its opening. In January 2026, Feld won Best New Restaurant and Best Hospitality at the Banshee Awards, an annual event that recognizes the best in Chicago's local culinary scene. For 2026's James Beard Awards, Jake has been recognized again and is in the running for Best Chef in the Great Lakes region. Congratulations, Jake. You can find out more about Jake through his TikTok account at NotYetAChef. And Feld's Instagram handle is Feld_restaurant. Before you go, what's one idea from this conversation you're taking back to enhance your practice? Share your thoughts with a friend, colleague, or student. Connect with me on LinkedIn and share your takeaways. If this conversation sparked something for you, share this episode with one colleague who needs to hear it. We release new episodes every couple of weeks during the school year. Subscribe and follow Foodagogy to be informed about what's next this season. Until next time, keep being socially responsible leaders who nurture inclusion in schools. I'm Angeline Au, and vielen Dank for tuning into Foodagogy. Foodagogy is produced by EKG Collective, with editing by Jitani Hevio and Kirk McDavitt. Music by Paul Romain and artwork by Svi David. Special thanks to Trisha Friedman and Frank Jung for sharing podcasting expertise and encouraging the birth of Foodagogy.